Ancient parenting philosophy, emphasis on virtue and moral behavior. Ancient Chinese people placed great emphasis on family manners and the cultivation of discipline and virtue. In ancient Chinese culture, there are 5 basic values: benevolence, righteousness, etiquette, wisdom, and honesty. Following these principles, ancient Chinese people cherished the philosophy of the cultivation of virtue and moral behavior in their parenting ways, and has regarded it as the dogma of family discipline. Ancient saints and sages showed great compassion and care for their children, but they were very strict with them too. In this way, they educated their children to follow virtue and thus lead a righteous life without regret. This ancient parenting method is actually very precious and of great value to us today. Let us take a look at some examples. The story of Confucius teaching his son to learn the classic of poetry and the book of rites. Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BC, was a great thinker and educator. It is said that he had more than 3,000 students. In 论语, there is a story about one of Confucius' students, Chen Kang, and Confucius' son, Kong Li. Chen asked, "Have you ever heard anything special from teacher that is different from his normal teachings?" Kong said, "No. Once, father was standing in the courtyard alone. I walked up to him and he asked me, 'Have you studied the classic of poetry yet?' I replied, 'No.' So he said, 'You have no grounds to say anything if you have not studied that yet.' Therefore, I hurried back to study it." Another time, I met father standing alone in the courtyard, and I walked up to him. He asked me, "Have you studied the book of rites yet?" I replied, "No." So he said to me, "You have no ground to stand on if you haven't studied that yet." So I hurried back to study it. I have only heard these 2 things. After hearing this, Chen was very happy. He said, "I only asked 1 question, but I have learned 3 things. I now know the importance of studying the classic of poetry and the book of rites. And I also learned that teacher treats everyone the same." Indeed, the classic of poetry and the book of rites are among the fundamentals of Confucius' teachings. Confucius said, "Poetry can express one's thoughts, poems can express one's aspirations, and songs can chant one's words." He believed that using art and literature as vivid teaching materials was more effective than preaching. It is said that the classic of poetry has 305 pieces in total, which were all compiled and edited by Confucius. Most of the pieces are about cultivation, following good ethics, and the will of heaven. Confucius believed that the cultivation of one's morality should start here, which could also build one's insight. In addition, one can learn a lot about history, nature, and sociology through reading them. He said, "Prosperity from the classic of poetry, sustenance from the book of rites, and success from the classic of music." When he talked about rites, he meant the standards of moral behavior and etiquette. Education starts from teaching students moral behavior and virtue. From practice, one can cultivate morality and discipline. Therefore, it can lay the foundation for one's future development in self-cultivation, governing society, or helping people. Confucius treated his son in the same way he treats his other students, in terms of studying the classic of poetry and the book of rites. He used the same standard and never lowered the bar for his son, from which we can see he treated everyone equally and had high expectations for his son and his other students. Scholars in later generations referred to Confucius' parenting method as leaving a family legacy with the classic of poetry and the book of rites.